There are mornings that arrive like any other, quiet, gray, ordinary, and yet carry within them the weight of something you will never recover from. The morning of March the 14th was one of those mornings. I remember standing in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the black veil over my hair, watching my own reflection like I was looking at a stranger. My eyes were dry, not because I didn't feel pain God, I felt so much of it, but because I had cried every tear my body had to offer over the previous 11 days. 11 days since the phone call. 11 days since a calm, professional voice on the other end of the line told me that my husband, Daniel, had been found unresponsive in his car on the side of a coastal highway, 200 miles from home. Cardiac arrest, they said. Sudden, unexpected. He was 44 years old. I kept smoothing the front of my black dress with trembling hands, as if making myself look presentable could somehow make what was happening feel less impossible. Our daughter, Lily, who was 9 years old and had her father's soft brown eyes, knocked on the bathroom door and asked if she could hold my hand when we got to the church. I told her yes. I told her I would hold her hand the whole time, and I would not let go. That was the only promise I was certain I could keep that day. Daniel and I had been married for 14 years. 14 years of small mornings and big dreams, of arguments about whose turn it was to take out the trash, and long, slow Sundays where we'd lie in bed reading books side by side, our feet tangled together, neither of us needing to say a single word to feel completely at home. He was a quiet man, not cold, never cold, but quiet in the way that still waters are quiet. Deep, thoughtful. The kind of man who remembered that you'd mentioned 6 months ago that your favorite childhood smell was fresh bread, and one random Tuesday morning you'd come downstairs to find him attempting, badly and beautifully, to bake a loaf of sourdough from scratch. He wasn't perfect, no one is. He worked too much. He carried his worries alone instead of sharing them with me. There were times I felt like he lived in a room inside himself that I was never fully invited into. But I loved him. I loved him in the way you love someone who has become so woven into the fabric of your daily life that you stop being able to imagine what the thread of your days would look like without them. And then in one phone call I had to start imagining exactly that. The church was full. That surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Daniel had touched many lives quietly, the way he did everything. Former colleagues, neighbors, people from the community center where he volunteered on weekends. I stood at the entrance greeting them all, nodding and saying thank you when people told me they were sorry, accepting embraces from people whose names I couldn't always recall, feeling the whole time like I was slightly outside of my own body, watching the scene from somewhere just above and behind my left shoulder. And then his brother arrived, Marcus. If Daniel was still water, Marcus was the kind of water that moved fast and loud, a river after heavy rain. He was 2 years younger than Daniel, charming in a way that always felt slightly rehearsed, handsome in a way that he had always been fully aware of. He and Daniel had a complicated relationship. They loved each other, I believe that, but there was always something between them that I never quite understood. A tension, a history I only ever saw the edges of. Marcus arrived at the church in a dark suit that looked expensive, with a woman I had never met on his arm. He kissed my cheek, told me Daniel had been one of the good ones, and moved past me with the smooth efficiency of a man who had somewhere else to be. I watched him take a seat near the front. Something in my chest tightened, though I couldn't have told you why. The service itself passed the way all such services do, in a haze of music and spoken words, and the particular suffocating silence that fills a room when everyone is trying very hard not to cry, or trying very hard to cry quietly enough not to disturb anyone else. The priest said beautiful things. A colleague of Daniel's spoke briefly about his dedication and his kindness. Lily sat pressed against my side the entire time, her small hand gripped tightly in mine, just as I'd promised. Afterward, at the reception held in the church hall, a man I didn't recognize approached me. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with silver hair and a careful, measured way of moving, like a man who had learned long ago to take up exactly the amount of space he intended to and no more. He introduced himself as Mr. Harold Vance, Daniel's attorney. I hadn't known Daniel had a private attorney. We had a family lawyer, a pleasant woman named Susan, who had helped us draw up our will years ago. But Mr. Vance was someone else entirely. His card, which he pressed gently into my palm, listed an address in the city that I recognized as a very old, very prestigious legal firm. He asked if he might have a few minutes to speak with the family before the afternoon was over. Family, in this case, turned out to mean me and Marcus. We gathered in a small side room off the main hall, just the three of us, with Mr. Vance seated across a narrow table, a leather briefcase open before him. Marcus lounged in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who expects good news. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, feeling vaguely numb. Mr. Vance explained that Daniel had updated his estate planning approximately 18 months ago, through this firm, and that he had left specific instructions about how his affairs were to be handled following his death. He spoke carefully and without sentiment, the way lawyers do, and I found myself focusing very hard on his words because focusing on precise, legal language was, in that moment, the only thing keeping me anchored to the room. Daniel's primary estate, his business holdings, his investment portfolio, certain property assets, had been assessed at a current market value of just over $40 million. I heard Marcus exhale softly beside me. Mr. Vance continued, "These assets, in their entirety, were to be transferred to Marcus. To Daniel's brother, every share, every holding, every dollar." The room was very quiet. I looked at Mr. Vance. I waited for the next sentence, the part where he explained what Daniel had left for me and Lily, for his wife and his daughter, the people he had come home to every night for 14 years. Mr. Vance reached into his briefcase and produced a single envelope. It was old, genuinely old, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges, the surface soft with age, as if it had been handled many times or stored somewhere warm for a very long time. My name was written on the front in handwriting I recognized instantly, Daniel's handwriting. Mr. Vance slid it across the table toward me. He told me that this was my inheritance. This envelope. He told me that Daniel's instructions had been very specific and very final, and that the envelope was to be given to me directly, and that I was to open it only after everyone had left. Marcus was already standing, already reaching across the table to shake Mr. Vance's hand, already calculating something behind his eyes that I didn't want to see. He clapped me on the shoulder on his way out, a gesture that was somehow both familiar and completely hollow, and told me that Daniel would have wanted us all to be okay. Then he left. Mr. Vance followed shortly after, pausing at the door to tell me again that I could contact his office at any time if I had questions. And then I was alone in the room, with a yellow envelope and my husband's handwriting on the front, and the sound of the reception continuing just beyond the closed door. I sat there for a long time, an hour, maybe more. I could hear the sounds of the reception slowly thinning out, the footsteps, the conversations dropping in volume, the distant sound of chairs being stacked. I heard Lily's voice at one point, somewhere in the hall, and my sister in. Lord Daniel's cousin, really, the one who had come to help, telling her gently that her mom would be out soon, and would she like a cookie? I held the envelope in my hands, and I did not open it. I'm not sure exactly what I was afraid of. I think, on some level, I understood even then, before I knew anything, that whatever was inside, that envelope was going to change things. Not in the way the past 11 days had changed things, with their brutal, sudden violence, but in some other way. A slower way, a way that required something from me, and I was so tired. I was so unbearably deeply tired. But I had promised myself in the smallest, quietest corner of my heart that I would be someone Daniel would be proud of, even now, even after everything. So when the last sound faded and the hall went still, I pressed my thumb beneath the seal of the envelope, and I opened it. Inside there were two things. The first was a folded piece of paper. When I opened it, I found a single line written in Daniel's careful, familiar hand. "Before you read anything else, please call this number. Everything depends on it. I love you. I'm sorry." And beneath the words, a phone number, a local area code, nothing else. The second thing in the envelope was a photograph. It was a picture of Daniel and me, taken on our 3rd anniversary. We were sitting on the hood of his old car, parked at the top of a hill somewhere in the countryside, watching the sunset. I had my head on his shoulder. He was looking at the camera with that quiet half-smile that I had spent 14 years being grateful for. On the back of the photograph, in the same handwriting, "This is the day I knew I'd never stop fighting for you. I don't remember deciding to call the number. I just remember that my phone was in my hand, and my fingers were pressing the digits, and I was holding the device to my ear, and the line was ringing. Once, twice, 3 times, and then the voice, a voice I knew, a voice I had heard every day for 14 years. A voice I had heard say good morning and good night, and I love you, and I'll be back soon, and don't worry. A voice I had heard read bedtime stories to our daughter, and argue gently about which restaurant to go to, and whisper in the dark. In that space between sleeping and waking, things so soft and private I had always kept them locked close to my heart. That voice said, "Elinor, it's me. I'm alive. Please listen. I'm going to try to tell you what happened next as clearly as I can. Because what Daniel told me in that phone call was not simple. It was not a single revelation but many, stacked one on top of the other like sedimentary layers, each one shifting the ground beneath my feet just as I was trying to find my footing on the one before. He told me he was safe. He told me he was sorry not once, but many times, and with a rawness in his voice that I had only heard from him on 2 or 3 occasions in our entire marriage. He told me that Lily was never to be frightened, that she would be protected, that everything he had done for us. And then he told me the truth. 3 years ago, Daniel had stumbled through the course of his business, across something he was never supposed to find. He worked in private financial consulting, dealing with large, large-scale asset management for corporate clients. He was good at it, methodical, careful, discreet. These were qualities his clients valued, and he had built a reputation on them over many years. But 3 years ago, one of his larger clients, a group of investors he had worked with for nearly a decade, began routing money through his firm in ways that Daniel recognized, slowly and with mounting horror as deeply, systematically illegal, not marginally unethical, not the kind of gray area financial behavior that he could quietly distance himself from, but genuinely, seriously criminal money that was tied to things so dark that even describing them made his voice go thin and hollow on the phone. He had tried to remove himself from the situation. They had made it very clear that removal was not an option. He had tried to gather evidence quietly, with the intention of going to the authorities in a way that would protect himself and his family. They had found out, and so Daniel had made a choice, not a perfect choice, not a choice without cost, but the choice that he calculated with everything he had gave his family the greatest possible chance of survival. He had worked with a federal protection agency quietly over the course of several carefully constructed months to stage his death. The accident on the coastal highway, the cardiac arrest that came from nowhere, all of it constructed with painstaking care, designed to convince the people who wanted him gone that he was, in fact, gone, that the threat had resolved itself, that there was nothing left to monitor or to fear, the $40 million going to Marcus that was deliberate too. It was money that the agency had flagged as potentially tainted by association. By routing it visibly, publicly, to Marcus, who was entirely innocent and entirely unaware of any of it, they created a traceable endpoint that served the larger investigation. Marcus would be fine. The money would be audited, cleared, returned to him once the case concluded. But for now, the movement of that sum served a purpose far larger than any of them, and the envelope was Daniel's way of reaching me. His one thread, the one line of contact that the people protecting him had permitted, because Daniel had made it a condition of his cooperation. He would help them. He would do everything they needed, but he needed Eleanor to know. He needed me to know he was alive. I sat in that empty church hall with the phone pressed to my ear, and I listened to my husband's voice for the first time in 11 days, and I felt things I don't have adequate words for. Relief so profound it was almost painful. Anger so deep it took my breath away, and underneath all of it, so much love. So much grief for the weeks I had spent believing him gone. So much grief for Lily, who had cried herself to sleep every night, who had asked me once, in that brutally simple way that only children can, whether Daddy was lonely wherever he was, and whether he could see her from there. I asked Daniel if he had thought about that, about Lily, about what she had gone through. His silence on the other end of the line was the most painful thing I had ever heard. He told me that there was not a single moment of a single day that he had not thought about her, about both of us, that the decision had not been made lightly, that he had lain awake in whatever safe house he was kept in and tried to calculate, over and over again, whether there was any version of this, any version at all, where he could have protected us differently, more completely, with less pain. He said he hadn't found one. He said he was sorry for that. He said he would be sorry for it for the rest of his life. I need to pause here for a moment and tell you something that I think is easy to miss in a story like this. In any story where grand gestures and impossible circumstances take center stage. Because it would be easy to focus on the $40 million, on the conspiracy, on the agencies and the criminals, and the carefully staged accident on a lonely coastal highway. These things are dramatic. They are the architecture of a certain kind of story, the kind that keeps you awake, that makes your pulse quicken. But that is not what this story is really about. What this story is about is quieter than that. It's about the 14 years before any of this happened. The years of ordinary mornings and small arguments and Sunday afternoons with books and tangled feet. The years of raising a daughter together, of building something real and imperfect and irreplaceable. The years of being known by someone, truly known, with all your rough edges and your private fears, and choosing to stay. Of being stayed with. It's about the fact that Daniel, when he was faced with the darkest possible corner of his life, made sure that his last act before disappearing was to leave his wife a thread. Not a fortune, not a legal document, a thread. A phone number written in familiar handwriting, tucked inside a yellowed envelope, inside which was a photograph of the two of them on a hill watching the sunset 14 years ago, with a note on the back that said, "This is the day I knew I'd never stop fighting for you." That's what this story is about, and I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I think it matters. I think it matters because love, real love, the love that survives real things, is not always visible from the outside. It doesn't always look the way we expect it to. It sometimes looks like absence. It sometimes looks like a choice that causes pain in service of something larger than itself. It sometimes looks like a man who couldn't tell his wife the truth because telling her would have endangered her. So instead he left her a single thread and trusted with everything he had that she would follow it. There is a kind of faith in that. A faith in another person that is, to me, one of the most profound expressions of love I can imagine. He trusted me to open the envelope. He trusted me to make the call. He trusted me to listen. I am not going to tell you that everything resolved neatly, because it didn't. There were months, long, difficult, uncertain months, during which I lived in a state of suspended uncertainty, during which Lily continued to believe her father was gone, because it was not yet safe for her to know otherwise, during which I attended grief counseling sessions and sat across from a therapist and said honest things about the texture of loss, things that were all true even if the full picture was not one eye. Good share. There were months during which I thought about Marcus, who had received $40 million and had no idea of the labyrinth that money had passed through to reach him, and I felt something complicated, not quite resentment, not quite understanding, somewhere in between. There were months during which I spoke to Daniel briefly on carefully monitored calls at irregular intervals, always with someone else listening. Our conversations were limited, monitored. We could not speak freely, but we spoke, and sometimes that was enough, just to hear each other breathe. Just to say, without words, I am still here, I have not forgotten, I am still holding the thread. And then, after 14 months, the case concluded. I won't go into the details, because the details are not mine to give. But the people who had threatened Daniel's life were no longer in a position to threaten anyone's life. The evidence he had painstakingly gathered, the cooperation he had maintained at tremendous personal cost, had contributed to something that the agency described in the measured language of official communication as a significant result. I received a phone call one Thursday morning in May. A different voice this time, professional, official, kind in that careful institutional way. The caller told me that Daniel was ready to come home. I did not tell Lily until the morning it was actually happening, not because I doubted it, not because I didn't trust the information, but because I had watched my daughter grieve her father with a completeness and a sincerity that broke something open in me, and I simply could not, allow her to experience the hope of his return and then have it taken away from her again. If something had gone wrong, if there had been a complication, if for any reason the morning had not delivered what it promised, I could not survive watching her lose him twice. So I waited until I heard the car in the driveway. And then I went to her room. She was sitting at her desk, drawing something in the sketchbook she'd carried everywhere since her father's disappearance, filling it page by page with images I tried not to look at too closely because they were too honest, too raw. A child's private language for feelings too large for words, and I said, "Lily, there's someone here to see you. Come downstairs." She looked up at me with her father's eyes, and something in my face must have given me away, because she looked at me for a long moment, very still, very quiet, the way Daniel had always gone still and quiet when he was reading a room, and then she set down her pencil, and she got up from her chair, and she took my hand. We walked downstairs together. The front door was open. He was standing on the porch in the early morning light, thinner than I remembered, older around the eyes, with the kind of stillness that comes from a person who has spent a very long time alone. With the weight of their choices, Lily stopped at the bottom of the stairs. She looked at him for a very long time. Then she said, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, "Daddy, I knew you weren't lonely." And Daniel, my quiet, still, water husband, the man I had watched hold himself together through every difficult thing life had handed him without once letting it crack him open, crossed the porch in 3 steps and knelt down on the front step and held our daughter like a man who had finally, after too long, been allowed to put down something impossibly heavy. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and let them have that moment, and I held the photograph from the envelope, the one from the anniversary, from the hill at sunset, and I pressed it against my chest, and I finally let myself cry. Not the dry, exhausted grief of the past 14 months, something else, something that felt, underneath the tears, remarkably like relief, remarkably like gratitude, remarkably like the very particular, very complicated, very real feeling of getting something back that you had made your peace with losing. Eventually, Daniel stood up from the porch step and turned to me. We looked at each other across the morning light for a long time. There was so much between us in that silence, so much that would need to be talked about, not today, not all at once, but slowly and honestly over many conversations that would not always be comfortable and would not always end neatly. There was anger that I had a right to feel and that he had a responsibility to hear. There was grief still for the 14 months of his absence. There was the long, patient work of rebuilding not just a marriage, but a life, which requires not only love but trust, and trust is a thing that, once disturbed, must be tended carefully and given time. I was not naive about any of that. But I also was standing there in the morning light, with my daughter's arms still wrapped around her father, with the photograph from a hill at sunset pressed against my heart. I also understood something, that love is not always about the absence of difficulty. It is not always about the clean, uncomplicated story. Sometimes love is the thing that survives, the thing that holds its shape even when everything around it is unrecognizable, the thing that leaves a thread in a yellowed envelope and trusts the other person to follow it, not because they have to, but because they choose to. I chose to follow the thread, and what I found at the other end of it was not the story I thought I was living, but it was still him, it was still us, and after 14 months of an absence so total it had reshaped the entire architecture of my days. That was enough. More than enough, it was everything. Daniel stepped off the porch and crossed the small distance between us. He took my face in his hands, both of them, the way he had always done when he wanted me to know he was really, truly there, and he looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "I never stopped, not for a single day. I want you to know that." I pressed my hand over his. I looked at him, at the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, at the gray that had appeared at his temples, at the steadiness underneath all of it, the deep, quiet steadiness that I had loved from the very beginning, and I said, I know you didn't." Music returned slowly, gentle, warm, unhurried. There is a hill somewhere in the countryside, maybe 2 hours east of the city, where the road runs out and the land opens up and you can park a car at the very top and watch the light change over the valley below. We went back there, the three of us, on a Sunday in late summer. Lily ran ahead, the way children do, and Daniel and I walked behind her slowly, close enough that our shoulders touched with every other step. He was carrying a blanket. I was carrying a small bag with sandwiches and fruit juice, things Lily had requested specifically, written on a list in her careful 9-year-old handwriting. At the top of the hill, we spread the blanket on the grass and sat together and watched the sun begin its long descent toward the edge of the world. Lily fell asleep between us, the boneless, trusting sleep of children, and Daniel and I sat on either side of her in the warm evening light and didn't say very much for a long time. At some point I reached into my jacket pocket. I had kept the photograph, the anniversary one, the one from the hill at sunset with his note on the back. I had carried it with me every day since the envelope, through all the months of waiting, through all the difficult conversations and the uncertain mornings and the long, slow work of rebuilding. I had kept it the way you keep a compass, not because you always need to look at it, but because you need to know it's there. I set it on the blanket between us, facing up toward the sky. Daniel looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at me, and in his eyes, in that quiet, still, water way of his, I saw everything I needed to see. I saw the 14 years before. I saw the 14 months of absence. I saw the long, imperfect, ongoing work of what came after. I saw the apology he would spend years expressing in small and consistent ways. I saw the man who had been so afraid of losing us that he had made the only choice he could find, and who would live with the weight of that choice with the same steady, quiet responsibility with which he had always faced the difficult things in his life. I saw him, and he saw me, and between us our daughter breathed the slow, even breath of someone entirely safe. The sun continued its descent, the valley below filled with golden light, and somewhere in the warm evening air, something that had been wound very tight inside my chest for a very long time, something that had been braced and guarded and holding on with everything it had finally, gently let go. I don't know what the future holds. I don't think anyone does, not really. But I know this. Love is not a place you arrive at and then stay in safely forever. It is something you choose over and over in the ordinary mornings and the extraordinary ones, in the moments of tenderness and in the moments of anger, in the silence and in the conversation, in the presence and sometimes, God help you, in the absence. It is the thread you follow even when you're afraid of where it leads. It is the envelope you open, even when part of you doesn't want to know what's inside. It is the voice on the other end of the line that says, I'm still here, please listen. And it is the person who listens. Even when listening is the hardest thing in the world, even then,